Hey there, it's Miss Seward, and today we're going to be learning about the phosphorus cycle. Continuing on the theme of learning about biogeochemical cycles, and today it's going to be about phosphorus. Now, our learning objective for today is going to be explain the steps and reservoir interactions in the phosphorus cycle. Some of the essential knowledge that you're going to gain is how the phosphorus cycle, the movement of the atoms and molecules, how they move in this cycle, the major reservoirs that you have, and the fact that there is not an atmospheric component in the phosphorus cycle. So we'll learn about some of the limitations that go with that. And the suggested skill that you're going to practice is to explain relationships between different characteristics of environmental concepts, processes, or models represented visually in theoretical contexts or in applied contexts. Now we're going to start with some phosphorus cycle basics. So the movement of phosphorus atoms and molecules between sources and sinks and reservoirs. So similar to the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, we're talking about sources and sinks and how the atoms and molecules move. So basically where you're mostly going to find phosphorus is going to be in rocks and sediments that contain phosphorus minerals. And this is going to be your major reservoirs. So if you look at this diagram here, you've got these mountains, and then you've got sediment, soil on the bottom, and that's going to be where you have a major reservoir of this. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the phosphorus cycle is a very slow cycle, especially when you compare it to the carbon, water, or nitrogen cycles. Phosphorus cycle is going to be much slower. And it takes a long time for phosphorus minerals to be weathered out of rocks and carried into soil bodies of water. So if you think of the fact that most of this phosphorus is in like rocks and stones and mountains, it takes a long time for that to be broken down naturally. Now, there is not a gas phase of phosphorus, so it doesn't enter the atmosphere. We're just going to see it here and not up in the atmosphere. And because it cycles so slowly, it actually ends up being a limiting nutrient, which means that plant growth in ecosystems is often limited by the availability of phosphorus in the soil or in the water. So that is going to impact the amount of plants that are able to grow in an area based on the phosphorus that is or is not available. Now, phosphorus is needed by all organisms for DNA, ATP, which is energy, bone, and tooth in animal. In some animals is how it's even used. So it is a required component, which is why it can be a limiting nutrient. Now we're going to start with looking at phosphorus sources. So major natural sources of phosphorus is going to be the weathering of rocks that contain phosphorus minerals. So the weathering of rocks is the process of them being broken down, which can happen through water, rain, wind. And wind and rain are able to break it down, and it gets broken down into phosphate. And phosphate is then released and dissolved into water. So rainwater will carry the phosphate into nearby soils and bodies of water. So if you think of this phosphate stuck up in a mountain, through the process with wind and rain, it'll get broken down and dissolved. And then the water will carry it down either into soil here or even straight into water. And as I mentioned with terrestrial ecosystems, because weathering is so slow, phosphorus is a limiting nutrient there. And that is still the same case in aquatic ecosystems as well. So both aquatic and terrestrial, phosphorus is going to be a limiting nutrient. Now, there is the way for humans to give sources of phosphorus through synthetic. So synthetic is not natural. And examples of this are going to be mining phosphate minerals and then adding it to products such as fertilizers or detergents or cleaners. So that's going to be where humans are actually taking out this phosphate by mining it. And so oftentimes phosphate mining, if you look at the mountainside, this whole mining process, they're going to be breaking down and digging in. So you end up also losing mountains and big areas of rock like this for fertilizers, and then it's also used in household detergents and cleaners. And these fertilizers are going to be added to lawns or used in fields. And one of the problems that can happen with this is you end up getting runoff that will carry the phosphorus into nearby bodies of water. So if you look at this fertilizer that's applied, it goes into the soil through leaching, or direct runoff can get into the local water. Additionally, you also have phosphates from detergents and cleaners that enter bodies of water because of wastewater from homes. So if you think of your clothes washer and you put detergents in there and it washes it, and then it goes down the tube, which then goes into the wastewater treatment, which eventually ends up back in the oceans or lakes or rivers. And so you can get phosphorus from those detergents that end up into other water systems. Now, another type of the part of the phosphorus cycle here, just like the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus is going to be absorbed by plants via their roots and then assimilated into tissues. And then the animals will eat those plants, and that's how they get phosphorus assimilated into them. So assimilation is basically just the process of phosphorus being taken in by a plant and becoming part of its tissues, and then the animal eating that plant and it becoming part of the animal tissue. Then we also have excretion or decomposition, and this is going to be in the form of animal waste or plant matter or other biomass that's broken down by bacteria, soil decomposers, and this is going to be a process that returns phosphate to the soil. So if we zoom in on part of that cycle that we were looking at in the last slide, you're going to have the animals and plants assimilating it, but then they also will excrete it, or if they die, they will decompose, and that's going to be a way that it can be returned to the soil. Now, assimilation and excretion / decomposition end up forming kind of this mini loop with the phosphorus cycle, just like assimilation and ammonification in the nitrogen cycle, or photosynthesis and cellular respiration in the carbon cycle. So we're starting to see that with these different cycles, you can end up with kind of a little mini loop going on. And that's what we see in the phosphorus cycle with assimilation and excretion and decomposition, is this sort of mini loop that can keep going. What we also have then is sedimentation and geological uplift. So phosphate actually doesn't dissolve very well into water. Much of it just kind of forms into these solid bits of phosphate that fall to the bottom as sediment. And if you remember, sedimentation is where this process of it falls down and then goes and makes it into that soil layer on the bottom of waterways. And these phosphorus sediments end up over time, lots of time, being pressed down by the pressure of the water, and it's going to compress it into sedimentary rock. Over long periods of time, this pressure is going to slowly kind of keep packing and forming, and then you'll get a whole layer of sedimentary rock from it. Then the process of geological uplift, this is actually going to be through tectonic plates, which if you know about tectonic plates, they move very slowly. So again, this is a slow process with the phosphorus cycle. But with geological uplift, this is where you get tectonic plates that collide, and then they end up like forcing up rock layers, which will form mountains. And then this means that the phosphorus cycle can start over again, where you have those mountains that get weathered down from the wind and the rain, and that releases phosphate from rock, and then you got the whole cycle going again. And remember, this is all happening within like the soil, plants, animals. None of it's in the atmosphere. And this is happening over a much slower process than some of the other cycles that we have looked at. Now we have this process of eutrophication, which we talked about in the nitrogen cycle as well. So hopefully this term is familiar to you, but eutrophication is going to be when you have too much nitrogen or phosphorus. Now, because they're limiting nutrients in aquatic ecosystems, when you end up adding in extra nitrogen and extra phosphate, then it leads to eutrophication, which is where you have excess nutrients, which then causes algae growth. As you see in this image, that's a lot of algae growing on top. Now, this can occur from fertilizer runoff or also from human and waste contamination. So this is why it is important to consider some of the runoff that is happening with stuff that can be going into the water. Because if it's a lot of fertilizers going into the runoff, then eutrophication can be happening in local waterways. Now, basically the way that eutrophication happens is it's kind of the step-by-step process. And the first step is going to be this algae gets this nitrogen, phosphorus, it's very happy, it's going to bloom, it's going to thrive, and then this algae bloom is going to take over and it's going to cover the surface of the water. Now that's great for the algae that floats on top of the water, but what it's going to do is it's going to block sunlight and it's going to kill any plants that live below the surface of the water. Now, eventually, that algae is going to die off because it's just the process. Typically in the winter, algae ends up dying off a large amount because it's getting cold. That's kind of the normal cycle. And when that algae dies off, then you have bacteria in the water that starts breaking down the dead algae. Now, this bacteria is a organism that's going to be doing cellular respiration. So they're going to be using up oxygen in the water because decomposition, it's an aerobic process. So it requires that oxygen. That bacteria is going to be breaking down the dead algae. They'll be sucking out all the oxygen that's in the water, which means less oxygen in the water, which other organisms like fish also needed that oxygen. So if there's tons of algae that's now being broken down by tons of bacteria and it's taking out the oxygen, then you end up having less oxygen. And so other animals are going to not have the oxygen they need. So it's going to kill them. Which then bacteria is now going to be like, yes, there are even more things for me to decompose. So they're going to keep using up even more of that oxygen to decompose the dead animals. And you just get this like massive process going where eventually you aren't going to have oxygen in the water. And what this does is it creates a positive feedback loop. So there's less oxygen, which leads to more dead organisms, which leads to more bacterial decomposition, which leads to more less oxygen. And if you remember, a positive feedback loop is where the effect is basically continuing to be amplified. So there's going to be less and less and less oxygen through this process. And if we look at this image here, this kind of shows you've got the nutrients that go in. You've got the plants, which then creates an algae bloom, which then creates more decomposition, which then ends up with the entire ecosystem eventually is going to crash when there is no oxygen. So what you're going to do today for your practice FRQ is you are going to look at this diagram right here, and you're going to choose two reservoirs that are depicted in the diagram, and you're going to describe how phosphorus moves from one to the other. So pick your two and then explain this is the process of how it goes. And between your two, you might have to explain multiple steps, or it might just be a pretty direct one, but you will describe between the two of them how it is that phosphorus moves. And that is going to be your notes on the phosphorus cycle. I hope you learned something from it.